Preface. Ethereal Hollywood is a world reconfigured from the golden age of Hollywood, where the legendary stars are not just memories, but immortal archetypes, still living in their own parallel alternative reality. Familiar history is not duplicated but flexible and constantly revisioning itself along diverse pathways. Time and space are also more fluid and less binding. And what has been called magic works in odd and unusual ways, producing scenarios from the silly to the surreal. And since these stories are in an alternative world or dimension, there are variances from real-world facts, such as the relationship between characters, studios, events. This is a fluid world where history flows in unexpected directions. These are audiobooks with imagery synced to the narrative as much as possible, serving as quasi-storyboards to give a rough visual dimension to the stories. Book 19 of the Ethereal Hollywood series. Torchy Blane and the Bowery Boys. Poetry in Motion. By Arnold Kalnitsky. The Ethereal Hollywood morning, usually a shimmering canvas of possibility for aspiring starlets and perpetually tanned producers, held a decidedly grayer hue for Torchy Blane, ace reporter for the Daily Bugle, and her lumbering companion, Sergeant Gohagan of the Ethereal Police Force. Their mission: to investigate the annual Ethereal Hollywood Poetry Contest, a prestigious affair now under the dark cloud of alleged corruption. "It just don't rhyme," Torchy, Gohagan grumbled, his ham-sized hand gripping the steering wheel of the patrol car as if it were a stubborn suspect. He puffed out his chest, a crumpled piece of paper clutched in his other hand. "My latest epic, Ode to a Grimy Gutter Garb, was clearly superior to that, Whispers of Elysian Fields driveled that one last year. It had heart. It had grit." Torchy, a vivacious blonde with a perpetually hungry glint in her eyes and a mind sharper than a freshly sharpened pencil, nearly chewed thoughtfully on the end of her pen. "Gohagan, your poetry has a unique fragrance. But we're looking for something more concrete than artistic injustice. Whispers of fixed results, a cabal of high-minded literary purists rigging the system to exclude originality. Their destination, the Ethereal Hollywood Cultural Center, a veritable temple to the arts, lay across town. But Torchy's internal radar, honed over years of chasing scoops and sniffing out savory facts, pinged for a more immediate, culinary necessity. "Hold it, Gohagan. My stomach just filed a class action lawsuit. Louis' Sweet Shop. My stomach has unanimously voted." Gohagan, whose own poetic sensibilities extended to the cadence of a chewing motion, didn't argue. He made a surprisingly deft turn into the Bowery quadrant, a charmingly disheveled corner of ethereal Hollywood where the glamour was less red carpet and more worn linoleum. Here, the dreams weren't of stardom, but of avoiding the landlord. Louis' Sweet Shop, a kaleidoscope of candy jars and syrupy aromas, was exactly as Torchy remembered it, a little sticky, a lot beloved. Behind the counter, Louis Dombrowski, a man perpetually teetering on the precipice of confusion, wiped down a glass case with a rag that had seen better days, probably in another dimension. "Torchy. Sergeant." Louis' eyes widened, a mixture of welcome and vague apprehension. He knew what their presence usually meant: trouble, followed by explanations he rarely understood. Before Torchy could order, the shop's door swung open, and in sauntered a pair of local legends, Slip Mahoney and Sach Jones. Slip, a dapper schemer whose suits were always a size too small and whose vocabulary was perpetually askew, led the charge. Sach, tall and gangly, followed, a human question mark whose perpetual befuddlement made Louis seem like pure enlightenment. "Louis, me old paladin," Slip declared, slapping the counter with a flourish. "Me and Sach are here to ameliorate our morning hunger with a couple of your finest jelly donuts. And maybe a few of those chocolate eclairs, strictly for medicinal proportions." Sach, ever the literalist, nodded gravely. "Yeah, Louis, my tummy feels like it's got a hole the size of a really big hole." Louis, already reaching for the donuts, sighed. "Slip, You still owe me for last Tuesday's Danish mountain and Sach's ice cream earthquake. Nonsense, Louis. Slip waved a dismissive hand. That debt is merely consequential, not actual. Besides, we're cultivating a relationship of fiscal reciprocity. He winked at Torchy, who merely smiled, already dissecting his linguistic artistry. Gohagan, meanwhile, was eyeing a particularly robust chocolate fudge cake. Say, Slip, I've been trying to find a rhyme for fudge. What do you think of smudge? Slip considered this, stroking his chin. Fudge and smudge, it's got a certain gravitational pull, Gohagan. But for true poetic persuasion, you need something with more oomph. More veracity. Sach, who had managed to get jelly on his ear, chimed in. Yeah, like Gudge. Torchy, between bites of a colossal bacon and egg sandwich, suddenly sat bolt upright, nearly dislodging Gohagan's latest ode from his pocket. That's it. Slip, Sach, you two are brilliant. Slip preened. Well, I do have a knack for the eloquence of words, Torchy. It's an inherent predisposition. Exactly. Torchy gushed, her eyes alight with inspiration. Your way of speaking, Slip, it's not wrong, it's alternative. It's a new form of communication. Malapropisms aren't mistakes, they're individual expressions of a language that's too rigid for your expansive thoughts. Gohagan, mid-fudge contemplation, blinked. So, when I say my poem has more passion than a pasture of parsnips, that's good. Precisely, Gohagan. Torchy clapped her hands. It's creative. And you too, she pointed at Slip and Sach, you should be teaching a course at the Ethereal Hollywood Cultural Center. Malapropisms, the art of individual communication. Slip's jaw dropped, then clicked shut as the gears in his schemer's brain began to whir. A course. You mean, like, with a podium and a blackboard and money? Oh, absolutely money. Torchy confirmed, her enthusiasm infectious. They're always looking for innovative programs. Think of it, a whole class of people learning to articulate their thoughts with your unique linguistic flair. Sach, having cleaned the jelly from his ear, looked confused but intrigued. So, I can say, the cat's out of the bag, when it should be, the cow's out of the barn. Even better, Sach. Torchy beamed. It's about personalizing language. It's about breaking down the elite barriers that stifle creativity. Louis, who had overheard the exchange, merely shook his head. A malapropism course. At the Cultural Center. The same place where they judge that fancy poetry contest. His confusion deepened, giving his face a permanently puckered expression. As Torchy and Gohagan left, promising to talk to the director of the Cultural Center, Slip and Sach began to whisper excitedly, already planning their sartorial choices for their academic debut. Louis watched them go, certain that the world was spinning faster than usual. Meanwhile, in the plush, velvet-draped inner sanctum of the Ethereal Hollywood Cultural Center, a different kind of linguistic discussion was underway. Gathered around a gleaming mahogany table were the titans of the stage, the doyens and maestros of classical performance, Ethel Barrymore, her voice like sandpaper on silk, Helen Hayes, poised and severe, the magnificent Laurence Olivier, radiating theatrical gravitas, the formidable Katherine Hepburn, sharp as a tack, and the charismatic, perpetually rumpled Richard Burton. The audacity. Ethel Barrymore boomed, her eyes flashing with a theatrical fire that could ignite a stage. These hoi polloi are attempting to infiltrate the very sanctity of our poetic traditions with their vulgar slang and their barbarous illiteracy. Next, they'll be proposing a sonnet about a hot dog stand. Indeed, Ethel, their grasp of the Queen's English is, shall we say, tenuous, Helen Hayes added, a delicate shudder passing through her. The very notion of a poetry contest being open to such unrefined entries simply cheapens the art form. We must maintain standards, a bulwark against the tide of plebeian drivel. Laurence Olivier, adjusting his ascot, leaned forward. The integrity of the English language, honed by Shakespeare, by Milton, by Wordsworth, is at stake. Our recent, Poetic Purity Protocol, was designed to ensure that the winning entries reflect the true grandeur and intellectual rigor of verse. Not some grimy gutter lament. He glared pointedly at a recent entry from Sergeant Gohagan, which had somehow slipped past the initial filters, titled, Ode to a Soggy Donut. Katherine Hepburn, ever the pragmatist, cut to the chase. Our efforts to elevate the contest have been successful, of course. Our carefully curated panel ensures only works of true literary merit reach the final round. And, naturally, our own contributions have helped guide the judges towards the proper aesthetic. She gave a thin, knowing smile. Their own entries, submitted under various elegant pseudonyms, had consistently won the top prizes for the last 3 years. Richard Burton, a glass of something amber in hand, grumbled, but word reaches me of a meddling reporter, a Miss Blane, and that oafish policeman, poking their noses where they ill belong. They suspect corruption. Corruption, Ethel scoffed. We are merely curating the cultural landscape. We are preserving the integrity of the arts for future generations, unsullied by the common tongue. And now, Helen Hayes added, her voice dropping to a theatrical whisper, I hear this Blane woman is championing some dreadful idea, a course in malapropisms. At our cultural center, it's an affront to Cicero. Olivier slammed his fist on the table. This cannot stand. These vulgarians, these purveyors of linguistic anarchy, must be contained. He looked around at the grim faces of his fellow legends. They must be taught a lesson in the enduring power of the classical word. Torchy Blane and Sergeant Gohagan arrived at the Ethereal Hollywood Cultural Center later that afternoon, Torchy buoyant with the prospect of an explosive exposé and a malapropism revolution, Gohagan still muttering about the elusive rhyme for fudge. I'm telling you, Gohagan, Torchy declared as they walked through the grand marbled entrance, this is bigger than just a rigged poetry contest. It's about the democratization of language. This malapropism course is going to blast open the doors of elitism. Gohagan, lost in poetic reverie, tripped over a potted palm. My thoughts exactly, Torchy. My poem, The Palm and the Predicament, explores similar thematic diversions. They found the director's office, but the door was ajar, and inside, a hushed, intense conversation seemed to be taking place. Torchy, ever the snooper, edged closer. And so, the only logical conclusion, came the unmistakable, resonant tones of Laurence Olivier, is to remove these obstacles from our path. Temporarily, of course, until their common sensibilities return, or they are no longer a threat to the purity of our poetic endeavors. But, Larry, is kidnapping truly a suitable denouement? Helen Hayes' voice, though still elegant, held a tremor of concern. Denouement, Helen, or simply a necessary plot device? Ethel Barrymore thundered. We are merely guiding the narrative. They will be perfectly safe, merely unavailable, until the contest is concluded, and the malapropism madness has passed. Torchy's eyes widened. Kidnapping. Her scoop just got a whole lot juicier. She nudged Gohagan, pressing a finger to her lips. Just then, the office door swung open, and standing there, in their full dramatic glory, were the entire ensemble of classical actors. Their faces registered a momentary flicker of surprise, quickly replaced by expressions of theatrical malevolence. Well, the meddlesome reporter and her poetic constable, Olivier intoned, stepping forward, his voice a low growl. Fate, it seems, has delivered you right into our hands. Or, as Shakespeare would say, the raven himself is Horace, that croaks the fatal entrance of Duncan under my battlements. Gohagan, bless his simple heart, looked confused. Who's Duncan? And where are his battlements? Silence, you ignoramus. Katherine Hepburn snapped. You wouldn't know a battlements if it bit you. Before Torchy could react, Richard Burton, with a surprising burst of speed for a man of his convivial habits, moved behind Gohagan, while Ethel Barrymore and Helen Hayes flanked Torchy. In a flurry of dramatic gestures and whispered, theatrical commands, they were swiftly, if rather comically, subdued. "This is an outrage," Torchy protested, struggling against Ethel Barrymore's surprisingly strong grip. "You can't just kidnap people for liking bad poetry." "On the contrary, dear girl," Olivier said, a triumphant gleam in his eyes. "We can and we shall. For the sake of verse, for the purity of language, for the very soul of Ethereal Hollywood's cultural elite." Back at the Daily Bugle, a palpable tension hung in the air. Max, Torchy's grizzled, gray-haired editor, paced his office like a caged bear. "She just vanished. Torchy Blane doesn't just vanish. Not when there's a story, or a donut, to be had." Captain Steve McBride, a mountain of a man and Gohagan's superior, stood grim-faced by the window of Max's office. His gruff exterior barely concealed a deep concern for Torchy. "Gohagan's gone too. Not that his absence isn't often a blessing, but usually he leaves a trail of bad poetry. This time, nothing. No haikus about lost shoelaces, no limericks about rogue pigeons." Max stopped pacing. "They were investigating that poetry contest, weren't they?" Torchy had a sniff of something fishy, something about highbrow snobs rigging the results. McBride's eyes narrowed. "Highbrow snobs? You mean that bunch of prima donnas who practically own the cultural center? Barrymore, Hayes, Olivier, Hepburn, Burton. They're always preening about literary standards." A grim possibility began to form in his mind. He knew Torchy's enthusiasm could sometimes lead her into enthusiastic trouble. "And Torchy was talking about some crazy idea for a malapropism course," Max added, scratching his head. "Said it was a way to democratize language. Sounded like exactly the kind of thing those classical actors would despise." McBride grabbed his hat. "That's it. They wouldn't take kindly to anyone democratizing their fancy pants poetry. And Gohagan's terrible poems probably infuriated them to no end. Max, get every available reporter on this. I'm heading to the cultural center myself. And I'm taking backup." The cultural center was eerily quiet when McBride and his squad car full of officers arrived. Too quiet. As they entered, a faint, muffled sound, like a tuba trying to clear its throat, echoed from a storage room in the basement. "Gohagan," McBride muttered, a flicker of exasperated affection crossing his face. "Only you." They kicked open the storage room door. Inside, Torchy and Gohagan were tied to chairs, gagged with silk scarves, looking more annoyed than terrified. Gohagan, meanwhile, was attempting to communicate by humming his latest composition through his gag, a mournful tune that did indeed sound like a distressed tuba. Facing them, holding court, were the 5 actors, arrayed dramatically. Olivier was delivering a soliloquy on the purity of verse, punctuated by grand gestures. Ethel Barrymore was fanning herself with a copy of a poetry journal, while Helen Hayes looked on with an air of refined disapproval. Katherine Hepburn stood arms crossed, a severe sentry. Richard Burton, true to form, was nursing a flask. "Hark! A new audience," Olivier announced, pausing his diatribe as McBride and his officers burst in. "Are you here to witness the triumph of classicism over vulgarity?" "We're here to witness a kidnapping, Olivier," McBride roared, drawing his service revolver. "Untie them, now." "Uncouth," Ethel Barrymore exclaimed. "A gun in the temple of art. Such a crass display." "We merely sought to enlighten them, Captain," Helen Hayes stated coolly. "To protect the sacred traditions of language from the blight of illiteracy." McBride wasn't in the mood for theatrical explanations. "You kidnapped a reporter and a police officer. That's a felony, not a dramatic monologue." Just then, a commotion erupted from the hallway. Slip Mahoney and Sach Jones, having decided that a malapropism course warranted a full dress rehearsal, had arrived, looking utterly out of place in their mismatched, yet earnestly chosen, academic attire. "We're here for our inauguration," Slip declared, his voice echoing through the grand hall. "Me and Sach are ready to teach the persecution of language through individual intentions." Sach, seeing the tied-up Torchy and Gohagan, and the angry actors, blurted out, "Hey, it looks like Torchy's having a bad hair day and Gohagan's having a bad hummer day." Olivier winced. The horror. The sheer, unadulterated horror. "This is exactly what we were trying to prevent." Katherine Hepburn threw her hands up in despair. "This is an epidemic. It spreads like a linguistic contagion." Torchy, finally freed from her gag by a swift officer, immediately pointed at the actors. "They rigged the poetry contest, Captain. They've been submitting their own entries under fake names, and they kidnapped us to keep it quiet and stop the malapropism course." Max, who had followed McBride, pushed his way through the crowd, snapping photos. "Max, get this down," Torchy yelled. "Elite actors, Shakespearean snobs, rigging a poetry contest and kidnapping innocent champions of linguistic diversity." The actors, suddenly realizing the gravity of their situation, began to look less dramatic and more panicked. Richard Burton gulped from his flask. "This is hardly the curtain call we envisioned," Olivier murmured, still trying to maintain some semblance of dignity. "It's a jail cell you'll be envisioning, Larry," McBride said, holstering his weapon as his officers moved to apprehend the star-studded conspirators. In the aftermath, the Ethereal Hollywood Cultural Center was temporarily closed for a much-needed dusting of its snobbish attitudes. The poetry contest was declared null and void, with a promise of a more inclusive and less curated judging process. The classically trained actors, protesting their treatment as if it were the greatest injustice since the invention of the close-up, were charged and faced a barrage of headlines screaming, "Barred bandits! Busted!" Torchy Blane, naturally, had the scoop of a lifetime, a front-page exposé that ran for 3 days straight. She even managed to squeeze in a paragraph about the culinary delights of Louis' sweet shop. And as for Slip and Sach, bolstered by Torchy's belief in their malapropistic genius, and ironically, by the notoriety of the case, they actually did teach a course at the Cultural Center. It was called, "The Eloquence of Error, a Bowery Boy's Guide to Expressive Language." It became an overnight sensation, drawing crowds of curious onlookers and aspiring linguistic rebels from across ethereal Hollywood. Louis Dombrowski, though still profoundly confused by it all, found his sweet shop busier than ever, as Slip and Sach's students often stopped by for a pre-class, brain food, donut, always on Louis' perpetually growing tab. Sergeant Gohagan continued to write his peculiar brand of poetry, now with an added layer of self-importance, convinced he was at the forefront of a new literary movement. His latest, Ode to a Misunderstood Malapropism, was particularly dreadful, and Captain Steve McBride, though still gruff, occasionally found himself smiling when Torchy, perhaps too loudly, declared it a work of sheer, unadulterated genius. For in ethereal Hollywood, where the line between high art and high comedy was perpetually blurred, even a bad poem could, in its own way, be poetic.